Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing on with the Perfect Trio Masterclass series, but this week I thought it would be fun to take a break and finally start painting. If you've missed any of the other videos in this series, I will leave the playlist linked in the cards above. If you are curious about any of the materials that I am using, or would like a detailed list of colors I recommend by brand, please check the description box down below for links. Also linked down below is my Patreon page. There you will find all of the free resources to accompany this masterclass, including printables, color comparisons, reference sheets, guides, PDFs, and more. These are all free and don't require an account. If you would like to see the real-time detailed tutorial of this painting, it can be found on my Patreon page for my tutorial tier patrons. There you will find this and other in-depth real-time tutorials for all of the demo paintings that I have done in this series and more. Each tutorial includes the pencil sketch for you to use, the reference photos, color mixing guides, and my tips, tricks, and techniques for completing each painting. Now to get started, I wanted to keep this painting pretty simple with its color mixes. We are mainly sticking to pinks and purples for this painting, and I have my palette in view for you to look at. I have mentioned this before, but I prefer to work with dirty palettes, so don't feel like you have to clean yours for this painting. I think using a dirty palette makes the mixes more natural and beautiful, and I like being able to use the existing paint on my palette. I know many of you have been following along in painting at home, so hopefully you'll have some pre-mixed colors on your palette. Do what feels comfortable to you, but if you're curious why your colors may be coming out a bit different, that may be why. I often find it helpful when using a clean or freshly set up palette to work with old, dirty paint water at first. If you would like to break in your new palette for this video, perhaps go through and do some of the exercises I've recommended in my previous video. If you need any of the templates for those to view or print, I have them available on my Patreon page, and I will also have the specific post linked down below. If you are unsure of what project to get started with, I would recommend making a color wheel to know your own colors and how they mix better. If you've seen my video on using and creating a color wheel, you will understand it's important in our projects as we move forward. This will help you understand how to mix our basic colors as well as neutralize. I chose this flower because of its organic shape and minimal color mixing. It's a fun, low-pressure beginner project to get started with. Before jumping into the painting, I would recommend getting started by mixing your colors for this project. As you can see, we are going to need a cooler pink and a warm purple for the majority of this painting. I also recommend mixing up a dark, near black purple color. This painting will also require a bit of yellow for the center, but this will also be used throughout the painting to create warmth, depth, and to help neutralize. Neutralizing our colors is an important skill that we will need for creating the very dark center of our flower. I'm painting this flower in glazes, meaning I'm layering the paint again and again to achieve the color, look, or depth I want. I'm also painting wet on dry, meaning the paper is dry as I apply the paint to it. Since this piece has a lot of texture to it, I'm being careful to allow each section to dry completely before adding more paint. I started by mapping out my sections with my cool pink color, keeping in mind the petal texture direction. Remember, this is done wet on dry to allow the texture to stay, but I'm not too concerned about the sections bleeding into one another. After the first pink section has dried, I'm going in with a smaller brush and I'm laying down the first wash of my purple section on these petals. I'm doing this a little bit lighter than I would probably want to, but you are welcome to have this color be a little bit darker. Really, the whole point of this is to start mapping in these colors, and when I do this, I like to use lighter colors to begin with. If you want to make a darker color when doing this, I want you to use our color wheel to start neutralizing the color. Remember, we want to use our large pool of our purple color and add our yellow to it until we get to a really deep value. Remember, we want this to be a near black, deep purple color. And on my palette, you can see that I do have it set up in a color wheel kind of formation with a section to one side for all three colors to mix those darker black colors. And I like to work up a whole pool of this so that I can use it throughout the painting process. Now, as the center section is drying, I'm going in and I'm using a slightly darker mix of my pink paint. And I'm going to start going through and adding some texture to my petals. This is a very textured flower, and I want to be able to go in and put in all of this textural look to the petals. And remember, since I'm doing wet on dry, I'm bouncing back and forth. So now that I know that I have those darker purple sections mapped in and dried, I'm going in and I'm finally starting to add my darker near black purple color. As you wait for one petal to dry, I'm kind of bouncing back and forth, going from one petal to another. I want to be really careful as I'm putting in this texture to make sure that I'm mapping it out in the direction that it's supposed to be going in. So when you are doing these first few lighter layers, be sure to make sure that you are getting that textural direction correct, because at this stage it's going to be much easier to fix than if you were to go in and do it very dark. Most of these paint mixes are just my blue and pink color, but I am mixing it in some slightly muddy sections of my palette, working from the grays and browns that are already there. And I'm just going through and I'm continuing to add texture. Most of the color that I'm using right now is the same color, so I'm just paying attention to my reference photo and I'm adding in these textural details where I feel like they need to be. Keep in mind that I do plan on glazing this flower quite a bit, so a lot of the dark textured area that I'm adding right now is actually going to be significantly darker in the final piece. But really, my main concern right now is making sure that the layers that I am putting down have time to dry before going in and adding more. Especially with this really dark center purple section, I don't want that to bleed into the rest of the flower. And you can see that as we start to get into the third glaze of this, we're getting a really nice deep dark color. And since this is so dark and saturated, you will notice that the paint texture is a lot thicker than you may be used to seeing with some of the other mixes that I have and with some of the paint that you're used to seeing. We want to pay attention to the consistency of our paint, especially when we're working on really dark colors. You'll notice it go from really light, flowy, and watery to a consistency that starts getting a little bit closer to milk and eventually something that has a lot more body to it. The more body that our paint has, the darker and more saturated these paints are going to look when you're painting with them. But also keep in mind that certain brands are going to have a lot of filler to them that may have some sort of shiny pigment spots on our paint. So just keep that in mind and know your own supplies when you're getting started. That's why I have a lot of different videos on here when we're getting started with this series about different things that I recommend looking into and ways for you to get more familiar with your own paints before starting an actual project. Now, a lot of this is just kind of going back and forth. Like I said, I'm looking at my reference photo and I'm paying attention to the colors that I need. I'm going back and forth between having this more of a hot pink kind of color, which is my pink and my yellow mixed together. I'm also using some of my yellow to have a little bit more warmth into the petals with a little bit of pink in some cases to warm it up to a bit more of a peachy color. So there's really a lot of range to this, and I'm someone who likes to mix kind of as I go, so it's a lot of just playing around and being a bit more intuitive with the color mixes as I go. And as you can see, I'm working a lot with some of the different colors that are on my palette, so I'm grabbing from the purples, the grays, the browns, the oranges, and I'm grabbing these little sections as needed as I go. The further that I get into the painting process with a palette that I have set up, the less strict I am about certain sections becoming muddy with my other colors. And this is really just because in many cases you're not going to need those pure colors, but I do try to keep them clean so that they're not getting too dirty along the way, especially the actual dollops of paint. One section that I do try to keep somewhat clean are the 3 dollops that are just the single colors, because those are easier to grab if you ever need them. And you'll see that I'm going through and I'm mixing different colors for shadow areas in my flower, especially where the petal shapes kind of start to overlap. I'm working with like a grayish pink color, and I'm making sure to really differentiate those sections. In the reference photo that I used, there was a bit of a white line, and I chose not to go with that because I felt like it seemed a little too artificial, but you can do whatever you feel is best. And like I said, I'm just going back and forth in some of the purple colors that I'm using. I'm adding a little bit of yellow to kind of gray them out a little bit, and I'm going back and forth. I'm not using a very cool purple in this. I'm sticking with very warm purples, and I'm sticking with that nice range of pinks that range from like a light kind of coral color all the way up to a cool pink. and I'm paying attention to how my petal shapes dip and change and how the shape of them will cause shadows in other areas. I bounce around a lot, and I'm making sure to really blend my colors, the pink colors from the edge of my petal shapes into that purple section, which is why you want to make sure that the purple is dry, because as you're blending that inward, it's not a literal wet on wet blending. It's wet on dry, and you want that hard purple shape to be really distinct. So I try to make sure that it stays dry. I'm also making sure to use paper that's 100% cotton for this. You can use whatever paper that you are most comfortable with or what you have on hand. But again, if you get to know that your own supplies, you'll know how it will handle these different techniques. So if you're someone who knows that your paper doesn't hold on to your paint as well as you might like, it might be helpful to do all of this pink texture work and then do the purple last. But do whatever feels right for you and your supplies. And I'm working a lot in my pink and blue section of my palette because that's where I'm mixing a lot of colors. As I start to get into those subtle nuances, I'm working in the center of the plate, again mixing from some of my other mixes. These are really more nuanced color mixes because, again, this is more of a fun beginner project. There's not a lot of color theory involved in it. Like I said, we're sticking mostly with like our pinks and purples. I really didn't want to get too far into neutralizing or other things. I really wanted this project to be a fun way to just kind of jump in, start painting, start playing, and for you to have something that you were able to paint with just 3 colors. It's a really great way to just get started. Other than that, it's mostly just patience. I work with really small brushes when I'm making this kind of texture. I started with a larger brush at the beginning when I was getting that base texture in. I believe it was a size 6. And then as I get further in, I work with smaller brushes like a 3, a 1, and then smaller brushes like my 3-0 spotter and stuff like that. And you can see in some of the areas where that purple is a little bit more subdued, when we're talking about neutralizing colors, we're not talking about always making brown or making black. What we are really talking about is just taking your color and dulling it down a bit. This is a very gradual step process that takes a little bit of time to get used to, and you really need to think of this the same way that you think about your dilution steps with your paint colors. Do it slowly, do it gradually, and just try to pay attention to the color shifting. If you have a piece of paper next to you, then go through, swatch out your colors, and see if it's the color that you were hoping for when you mixed it. You're not looking for a gray color in your petal shapes or a brown color, but what you may be looking for is a corally color that has been neutralized a little bit to be perhaps a little bit warmer, and it's just a really nice shadow color for the lighter part of your petal, so that it gives the illusion of having a shadow or some fold or texture to it, because this is an item that is found in nature. It's not going to be perfect and pristine and completely flat. It's going to have some shape to it that will cast some shadows. And since this is a project that uses quite a bit of layering, you can do as much or as little as you like. If you feel more comfortable doing maybe 1 or 2 layers, that's completely up to you. If you are someone who wants to do a lot of layers, then sit back, relax, and just have fun with the process, because it's a lot of fun to really get lost in these details. At least I think so. So if you're neutralizing your paint colors, you're not always going to have this kind of stark line that you see in the beginning. It's going to slowly fade out. And if you are glazing your colors, it can really help to camouflage it in a way. So if you have this area that's a little bit grayed out for a shadow area, and you're going in and you're glazing over the top of it, you just have that shadow section that kind of glows through from the bottom. It's not always going to be this weird section that's going to look a little bit off. And with something like this, when you are really jumping around, I really like to kind of take a step back and look at my painting and come back to it to see what I may be missing. Because it can be kind of easy when you are doing a painting like this to skip around and maybe not develop one section of your flower or your subject as well as you might like. So being able to kind of come back at it and look at it is really helpful. Alternatively, if you are someone who likes to really work on and develop one section at a time, you can do that. I'm someone who prefers to let my paint air dry. I find that if I use like a heat tool to dry it, I really don't like the kind of color shift and effect that it has. That could just be me, but of course do whatever you like to do in your own color, in your own painting practice. And you'll see that as I'm going through, I'm darkening up this center section a little bit more as I'm taking a step back from developing the outer edges of the petals. Sometimes, especially when you start doing a lot of work, it can be maybe a little bit hard to notice that some of your sections are getting a little bit wet. So I do like to kind of step back, work on another section entirely, and then come back to it once I've had a second. But I hope that you are enjoying this painting. I hope that if you did it, that you will tag me on social media so I can see it. If you are a patron, keep an eye out for the real-time tutorial of this to be coming out soon. There I will have the actual reference photo to follow along with. I will have the pencil sketch if you choose to use it. And I will also have more in-depth color guides going through the different colors and really nuanced colors that I used in this painting process. If you are someone who maybe has a hard time following along with the really sped up version that I have here on YouTube, I know it can be a little bit difficult to see what I'm doing, but if you are someone who really values having those slower, longer, real-time tutorials, then you are more than welcome to join me over on Patreon, and you can find it there. Because these are a little bit more nuanced color mixes that I'm making, and it can be easier to explain that when I'm showing swatches or something similar. But I hope that you have enjoyed this painting and this painting process. I hope it was a really great way for you to get started with working with just 3 colors, and I hope that it did help you get a little bit more familiar with the trio that you chose. If you like this video, I hope that you would consider giving it a like or a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment down below to let me know if maybe you liked this project or just your thoughts on this trio project overall. Also, feel free to leave any questions. I'm happy to go through those and answer them. I try to stay as active in the comment section as possible. But that is all for this video, and I will see you next week for our next Perfect Trio video. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!